We've been playing games for a very long time, and we've seen some pretty big technological progresses in terms of map size and exploration that games have achieved across the years. And this year, with so many releases, Starfield was perhaps one of the biggest and most expected game to come in 2023, and apparently has been received very poorly. Although I disagree with some of the critiques that have been made of the game, when it comes to the critiques about the exploration side of Starfield, I find myself in an agreement with those critiques. And the video today, it's going to be about that topic exactly. Why? I found myself to think about why when I go and explore different places, they seem to be so boring and miss that uniqueness mark that Skyrim, for example, had in terms of exploration. So I'm a big fan of space games. I love it. I like the astronomy and everything regarding the universe. And I found myself to play other games, EVE Online, Elite Dangerous, No Man's Sky. And in every single one of them, the one main thing that really put me off these games, which are beautiful games and I like them and I play them, but the constant issue that put me off when I was playing these other games was the space exploration itself. So why I have the same exact sensation of boredomness and sameness and that mismark of uniqueness that it misses completely. It's not there. Every time I find myself trying to explore and surprise myself with new elements of exploration, which should be integral part of why am I exploring in the first place. After playing Starfield, I booted Elite Dangerous and I booted No Man's Sky as well. And I've played focusing on exploration most, to try and remember why exactly this was happening, why there is a problem when I play these games with the exploration bit. Because the games have other mechanics which are extremely fun, but when it comes to the core mechanic of exploration that I want to like, I end up disliking mostly. Why is that? So I've dig in a bit. Now I'm not a developer, but I did find some good insights. And there's an article from gamedeveloper.com that I will link in the description. I had to read through it. You can have it as well. It's about an 8 minutes read that really tackles the three main issues that I'm about to speak of, which are the procedurally generated content and the use of this procedural generated content when it comes to developing video games. So let's have a look through it and see what exactly seems to be the problem when it comes to massive worlds and the exploration bit of these massive worlds. First of all, let's go through what procedural generation in video games it's about, what exactly is. So the article states that at the basic form, it's an evolution of random generation in games. Random generation is when a game does not present content in the same order every single time, creating a certain randomness to it. It can go from as simple as what type of items drop during combat to what level of environments and other things like procedurally generated dungeons or stuff like that. Random design is based on hard values with a degree of malleability, such as opening a treasure chest and getting a certain item. But the problem is that given time, while playing through the game, a player can find themselves to see all of the random elements of a game and getting very familiar with every aspect of this randomized system. Because these systems are a preset, so there's a limited combination of them. Now with procedural generation, things go a little bit further. instead of just giving the game engine a list of things to choose from, the designers will create an algorithm and will give the AI a set of instructions to use while using random preset values. Now, what is the problem? The three major limitations of the procedural generating content with AI is this. For one, it's the limited foundation. What exactly I'm talking about? So, for procedural generation to work, the player's own interaction with the game must be kept basic. Why is that? It's because the algorithm has to be designed to work around every mechanic and system that the player has access to. Jumping, running, shooting, interacting with the environment, all of these elements, the algorithm has to take into account in order to deal with all of this accessibility of the player. The more mechanics are in the player's toolkit, the harder it will be to create something that can use all of it in the entirety. This is why many games use procedural generation built horizontally, not around the player mechanics instead. For example, in the game Don't Starve, the player's means of interacting are by using items, which is a linear process every single time. And the procedural play comes in with how the world is built, using biomes and fill it with interactables and enemies and whatnot. The problem with this reduced complexity of the AI is that the player knows exactly the limits and abilities. So you get a pretty rough idea pretty quickly of how to play the game, no matter what type of randomness the AI tries to throw at you. Second, procedurally generated content cannot create uniqueness. Why? Because the more abstract the move set of the player is, the harder, to the point of impossible, is to create an algorithm around it. For example, Spelunky works so well because the rules and design of a platformer are relatively easier to process by an AI, okay? Because the elements the player has in his toolkit are relatively smaller. And for example, you have the jump length and height. Based on those two elements, you give the AI those restrictions and they can build the level around it. However, when you look at unique mechanics, more complex mechanics like AAA games like Starfield and No Man's Sky that have a lot of complexity to the toolkit of the player, any attempt at procedural design falls apart. What exactly they're talking about here is that you cannot program the AI around lateral thinking. The writer says that someday this could change with emergent AI. Maybe. Although AI is doing a lot of progress, we are still very far away, I think, from being able to have an AI and an algorithm so complex that can take into account the complex variations that the human mind can generate. The more elements you give to a player in a certain environment in a game, the more options the player has to create something new, something unique, something that you haven't foreseen, which is exactly the reason why AI and the algorithm based on presets and sliders cannot keep up with how we think. And this is why uniqueness goes straight out of the window, because we have to sacrifice complexity and maintaining basic for it to work in the first place, to be able to actually create a game, to create some levels that have some level of depth. But usually the reason why this happens and how procedurally generated is used today, it's in most games it's used as filler content. The grass on the land, for example, can easily be procedurally generated along some items here and there, but the main levels and scenarios and environments and mechanics of the game have to be handcrafted. So this gives us the third point, which is mass-produced versus handcrafted content. Anyone who has played games with procedurally generated levels can see how they're usually filled with areas of dead space where nothing happens, or even worse in some lower quality games. If you look at games like the Soul series, in almost everything is handcrafted. Every piece of environment it's been put there and placed meticulously in a certain way in order to give a certain design, a certain character and personality to that level. But how other games handle and use procedurally generated levels, despite the variety of possible designs, there are always that same level of similarities, of sameness, right? In handcrafted levels, it's okay because the personality and uniqueness of the design will keep you engaged. Everything that is handcrafted has personality, is unique. It's intended to engage the player, to give emotional appeal or to give engagement to the player, hence why it works. Something that the algorithm cannot achieve because it's not designed around the human thinking. It's designed around combining together a certain level and elements of a preset and some sliders in order to give it structure to a level. But it can't adapt to our way of thinking, hence why it doesn't have any intentionality behind it and doesn't give that uniqueness and that engagement to the player. And that is a problem. The reason why I'm saying this is because procedural generated, it's very good at doing something, which is creates massive worlds. If you look at No Man's Sky, it has 255 galaxies. Elite Dangerous has 400 billion planets. Our Earth is almost 200 million square miles. Some of the maps that are well crafted, for example, Skyrim, which is a pretty old game, so it's not the biggest by all means. But imagine Skyrim, it was 15 square miles. And if you look at GTA, well, GTA was 31 square miles. When it comes to space games, the issue is that handcrafted being so limited to under 100 square miles, which is a very tiny portion, a very minute portion of the coverage of Earth, for example, as a planet, you can see how doing handcrafted maps for exploration, it's very, very difficult and time consuming. And it will be absolutely impossible to make, for example, an entire level, like Skyrim, for example, as big as Earth. But with procedurally generated content, you can create 255 galaxies, like in No Man's Sky. You can create a system with 400 billion stars and planets. You can create a starfield game with over 1,000 planets to explore. Which on the paper shows is that procedurally generated content, it's very good at making these giant, huge worlds. The problem, though, is that barren planets, nothing new to see, the sacrifice of uniqueness, and the randomized elements which you get very familiar with extremely quickly. It's the reason why space exploration games do fail time and time again to give us satisfaction in exploration. I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not arguing that procedurally generated it's bad, nor that Starfield or No Man's Sky or Elite Dangerous are bad games. By no means. But when it comes to the exploration side of it, which is really what entices us to go into space-themed games, it's where really the disappointment comes in. Not much the disappointment of how the game is being developed, but more into the technical limitations of our hardware and our softwares and the AI. These technicalities and these limitations we have. Unfortunately, I think we are very far away from seeing a space game that it's capable of keeping up with our demands of space games, with the exploration theme of space games. It's very easy, relatively speaking, to handcraft a 70 square miles, 100 square miles map, very compact, very cool, with uniqueness and character to it. You obviously need hundreds of people to work on it, but within a number of years can be created. But that it's obviously very, very limiting. Because unless you can employ 500,000 people to work on a map, you can't make it any bigger. You have to rely on procedural generating content to enlarge the scope and the size. The problem is you'll have to sacrifice uniqueness. And usually games do use a combination of the two. the most advanced engine from, as far as I can tell, that works on almost entirely procedural generated content. It's the engine for No Man's Sky, which does a very good job. But it's, when it comes to exploration, it's hardly satisfactory, in my opinion. Now, this might be a hard take for some people, and some people might enjoy exploring. But I find myself, time and time again, when exploring these giant procedural generated games, to have the same old issue. There's no character to it. There's no uniqueness to it. Everything I explore seems to be, although random, very similar. And it's basically the same puzzle, just with a different orientation. But it's the same thing. And I'm looking at the same thing. And takes all the enjoyment out of the exploration bit, which requires uniqueness and requires that element of surprise, which is completely gone if stuff is not handcrafted. But obviously we can all understand the technicalities and the limitations of it. And this is, I think, the reason why space games really fail. Starfield as a space game, exploration game, which is not, by the way, but that element of the game, it's not good. Of course it's not, because having to try and explore similar structures time and time again with similar biomes no matter where you go becomes very, very familiar. You familiarize with it very quickly. And out of the window it goes the uniqueness and the surprise of it, which really doesn't give you an incentive to keep exploring. But I could argue the same of No Man's Sky and Elite Dangerous. Elite Dangerous because it tries to keep it as real as possible, so barren planets, it's what it is. And No Man's Sky, although you have an entire biome in each planet, those biomes end up being the same thing repeated over and over and over. You will have an amount of preset planets, and there's gonna be that repeatable element every time you go to a planet over and over and over. Although I would imagine No Man's Sky is probably the most advanced engine to do procedurally generated, because it seems to be the highest level of interaction with a player when it comes to exploration. But still, I think it's far, far away from exploration and enjoyment of the levels and the environment, even when compared to a 15 square miles Skyrim map. We have 255 galaxies, or 1,000 planets, or 400 billion stars. It does not matter to me. Because Skyrim, it's gonna offer that uniqueness and that surprise when I explore, which is gonna make the game a lot bigger in my mind. I will perceive the game as much bigger and engaging than all the planets in the world. So that's what I think are the main three limitations, reason that Starfield is perceived so bad. But what I believe is the issue when it comes to space-themed exploration games in general. I'm really eager to hear your points and what do you think about it. Do you find yourself in the same situation when playing space-themed games? Do you find exploration based on procedural generated content having those similarities and being boring after a while, or do you have a different take? Do you enjoy it, or maybe you don't pay too much attention, or do you even explore as much in any other games? And if any developer out there can give us some insights on how exactly this whole thing works, and how difficult really is to give AI directions, or how to interact with and compare itself and deal with the human element that creates an almost infinite amount of variation based on what elements they're giving to the player tool in the game. That would be great. So I'll see you next time.